In our last Excel video, we're going to take the equations that we have or the graphs that we have and talk about common mistakes that happen and how to fix them. So one thing that when I'm looking at this graph automatically jumps out to me is this outlier over here. It's probably been bothering a lot of you, like, why is that there like that? And it's for this moment, actually, to show what happens. So this 80, maybe it shouldn't be 80. After you've talked with your lab group or something, you've collected data, maybe someone wrote it down wrong, or maybe you just misheard, or whatever the case may be. But maybe you realize that shouldn't have been 80. That should have followed the rest of the trend, and it should have been the number 11. Now, remember when this 5 we changed to 50, and it changed everything that was calculated after that. Watch what happens when we click on enter from this 11. Notice, not only did the time squared value change and the sum that came from that, but also the whole graph changed. And it happened fast. So let's go back to 80 so you can watch the graph. So the first thing it did is it's going to take this dot and it's going to move it all the way over here to 11. At that point, Excel is going to look at that data and say, let's fill the screen with it. So the scale here shouldn't go all the way up to 90, but should go up more to, somewhere between 10 and 15. Then it took this trend line and drew it appropriately for that new set of data, which would be much more in line, as you saw. And then it takes this equation and it gives it a much better y-intercept. See, the y-intercept right now is about 25 and the slope is about 0.5. Let's again watch what happens when I change it to 11 and hit enter. And there we go. So r squared has changed. The y-intercept is now 0. That's why it's not here, but it is plus 0 because we see that's going to hit there. And the slope is 5, which makes a lot of sense. Remember, these counted up by 5 every 1 second that went by. What it didn't do, though, is this. The equation we formatted has not been modified because once you click and type in this text box, you are locking it so that it cannot be modified any longer. So that should be the very last thing you always do. Otherwise, you run the risk of doing double work. All right. So if we're making a graph, once you make the graph, check your X and Y axis, make sure they match what the data and the graph that I'm asking you to make is supposed to be. And then at the same time, then once you're sure that that is right and your data is correct, then you can go ahead and modify this. Otherwise, you risk doing extra work. One more thing that I didn't show you, if you ever want to forecast this trend line, we're going to click on the plus sign again, or you can actually click a few different places. And that's a big thing with anything in Excel. There are lots of different ways to do the same things that I'm showing you now. If you know a different way, as long as it still works, do it that way. So in my trend line here, if I want to ever forecast it either more forward or more backward, I can just click on this box where it says backward. Maybe I want to have it hit the X or Y axis. So its smallest X value right here, this dot is 1 second. I can just change the backwards to 1. If I want to see what it looks like without closing this little panel over here, I just click where it says forward. And you see it extended that backward. If I wanted to go more forward, I can just click here and change this to 20. And so it's at about 11 now. It'll go ahead 20 more. If I turn out I don't like that, I can just change it back to 0. And it goes back to what it was. All right. So the other common issue that we run into is related to graphing data that is separated from each other. So here we have position versus time. They're kind of separated from each other. So here's what we would do if we wanted to create a graph of position versus time squared. And you might have noticed that since the last video, I've added this column of data that says temperature in between. I'm doing that just to add like a blocker to make sure that we realize that we can't just do what we did before and drag across. We can't just do that because now we're going to get this temperature data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, hold down Control, Notice, please understand, I highlighted this and now I'm not clicking anything. Now I'm going to hold down Control and I'm going to highlight the next set of data. Now that I've done that, I can come over here to Insert again, click on Insert, Scatter, Plot, and always the one with just the dots. There we go. Now we have a graph. But ask yourself if it's the graph of position versus time squared. Remember, our position goes up to 55. Looking at this graph, I see no, right here. This is where position is. Position actually ended up on the x-axis. And again, that makes sense if we remember what I said about Excel before. It's going to take the data that's all the way on the left and it's going to put it on the x-axis. So if I want position to be on the vertical axis, if I want this to be a position versus time squared graph, I have to do one of two things. Either I could go back to originally what I did, and instead of having these columns here, maybe I cut or copy and paste them over here into column J and K or anywhere else, and I make my graph from there, making sure the time squared is on the left and position is on the right. That would be one way to do it. But since the graph is already made, there are a few other ways we could do it. One way, and I think this is the easiest way, click on one of these dots. That can sometimes be harder than you think, but usually it's a little bit lower than what you really mean. And you can see up here in this address bar, this formula bar, it has now given me the formula of that equation. And look at what it's done. It says from B2 to B12, that's this. That's what it's calling the X values. And this is D2 to D12. That's the Y values. So you see, this is actually an ordered pair, right? This is X, comma, Y. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch them. Instead of B, I'm going to make those D's. And instead of the D's, I'm going to make them B's, or whatever letter you have, two-letter pair you have there. I'm going to switch them. And watch what happens to this curve that's like this. It automatically corrects itself to the curve that we're looking for. All right. So that would be a really easy way to take our graph that is incorrect and to correct it. As I said before, though, what we could do is we could take and move this data. So if I wanted this instead to be over here and this to be over here. Now, notice what just happened there. When I copy and pasted this over, because it was doing calculations based on the numbers that were next to it, when I moved it over, it was still looking to square the number that was 1, 2, 3 blocks over. So it's trying to square what's in H, and it can't square what's in H. The only thing that's in column H is the trial. But when I paste, this option comes up down here. I can paste values. So it'll just paste whatever numbers over here. And I get that. And now if I highlight that, go to Insert and Scatter Plot, we see we get the same graph of position versus time squared like we had from before. Some of you will also know there are other ways to do it, to look at the data that you have and to modify that. But I think these are the two easiest ways for you to do this. This idea of flipping your X and Y axis, whether you are moving your columns of data or whether you're clicking on one of the dots and modifying the equation, are going to be very helpful, because often you will end up with data that is not, well, often, about 50% of the time, you'll end up with data that has it on the wrong axis and you'll have to change it. So it's always something to be looking out for to make sure that that doesn't get you. All right, I hope this has helped you with Excel. If you have questions, certainly ask your teacher. And we're going to now probably proceed into practicing this strategies.